Alright, so basically I'm just going to go through how you'd set up a simple scene in Unity that you can turn into a GIF and present as an NFT or anything you want, just as an art piece. It's a pretty simple process. There's a few tricks. I'm not going to go through rigging models manually in Maya. That's hugely out of scope. That's a really big job. It's a skill that can take months to sort of master, but a basic rig and some basic free animations that you can find on Mixamo isn't too hard at all. So you can start with log into Adobe Mixamo, set up your account, log in, have a look at what's available there. They've already got a bunch of models that are already rigged with a skeleton that will play nice with all the existing animations in their portal. If you want to bring in your own model that you have rigged, it can be tricky. If you have got a model that isn't rigged whatsoever, it should work. What you'll need to be careful of is just that if you do have a rig, it needs to be relatively humanoid. So it's looking for arms and legs, and it wants either a T pose or an A pose, so it can reverse engineer that to be able to integrate with their existing animations and the rig that they use in Mixamo. So where I'll start is I'll just upload something I downloaded off CG Trader that isn't rigged. So this is a pretty basic character model. It's got no rig. So what's going to happen is Mixamo's auto rigger is going to ask you to, first of all, orient the character in the standard T pose. So he wants to be facing the camera, standard T pose. Now you just line up these indicators with roughly where they should be. Wrists, elbows. If you've got a character that's non-symmetrical, obviously you have to turn that off. If you've got some sort of character with maybe a tentacle for one arm or something like that, that's where you turn off symmetry. But standard character, humanoid character is always going to look like this. So there you go. So that's lined up. You've got some options there. If you don't want to bother with the fingers, or if you do need fingers for additional animation, holding objects, things like that, you need to add those features. But I'm just going to start super basic here and let the rigger do its thing. Have a sip of your coffee. And the idea is then to import this model once you've got your animation, download it as an FBX file. You'll import that into Unity, and there's a couple of little tricks that I'll show you when we get into Unity. But otherwise, this part of the process is pretty simple. And like I say, if you wanted to pick one of their existing characters, these characters are licensed for use in commercial projects, but you can't sell them on their own individually. If you use them inside another project, that's fine for commercial use. That's kind of how Mixamo is designed, so there you go. So that's rigged successfully. You might have some issues with that part of the process. Some characters I've tried to import haven't worked. This guy's pretty humanoid, so he worked, and you can see the fingers animate properly, so it's pretty advanced the way the auto rigging tool works. It's pretty cool that Adobe allow this to be used for free. So there you go. So that's the character inside with an animation applied. What we're going to do is find a simple walking animation. Something where he's just walking forward. There you go. That's fine. Set it to in place. If you want the guy if you want to animate it in Unity, it's generally easier to use in-place animations. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you don't have in-place turned on, that's called root motion animation, and that means the motion is baked into the animation. So if he's on an environment, he'll move the way that he's moving in the screen there. Whereas if you have in-place, you can determine later on in Unity with code where he's going to move. So if you're making a video game, for example, you'll almost always want in-place animation, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Root motion will often look better. Really, if you're just trying to create something simple, this is where you want to start. So in-place animation, you got arm space determines how wide his stance is, how wide his arms are out from his hips. So if you've got a character that's skinny, bring the arms in a bit. Got a character with wider hips, wider waist. Push the arms out a bit so it looks natural. That's done. And obviously, certain animations will have different options in the slider. None of this stuff really matters for what we're doing here, so as long as the arms look natural, we're fine. Now that's good to go, so you can download that. If we're already using a character that we already had previously with its own skin, none of this matters. You don't need to bring the skin back down again, you already got it. If you're using Unity, obviously you want FBX for Unity. May as well take the highest frame rate. Depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you want a more cartoony look, you might only need 30, but 30 is fine for this purpose, but you might want to turn it up just to get the best fidelity possible. Depends what you're trying to do. Uniform keyframe reduction is not necessary here. It'll look fine when we bring it into Unity anyway. We download our character. Let me just save that. Once we've got that on local drive, we're going to go into Unity. I'm just going to create a new project. If you haven't got Unity, it's free. Depending on what you want to create, 3D is probably fine. It's such a simple project. I mean, if you're making a video game, these other options are actually relevant, but for what we're doing, just 3D is fine. You create that, and then just give Unity a minute or two to set up the project. And so when Unity launches, you get a default scene and layout like this. And to get around inside Unity, you can use FPS like first-person shooter controls. So WASD, hold right-click down, and that'll activate the controls to work the same as the shooter. So WASD to move forward and to strafe, and mouse to look around, and then you can hold Shift, and it's essentially like sprinting. It's very much like a first-person shooter when you're in these controls, when you're holding right-click. So that's the basics for moving around inside the scene. I'm just going to take that character and drag him in. You'll probably want to organize this structure a bit nicer when you're doing a real project, but I'm just going to dump everything in that root folder. So that's the character right there, ready to go. Drag it into the scene. And if you press play now, it's not going to do anything. It doesn't have an animation controller. Pretty simple to get started with this. Okay, so when you press play, it's going to switch to game view. It's kind of irrelevant. You switch back to scene view and you can keep moving around while it's live. And I'll just show you, if we add a material, create a new material, and we'll just call this white, and it'll be white. Maybe we can make it a bit shinier. Play around with all this stuff. There's lots of tutorials to get you started with that. So you can see he's got a few different surfaces. I don't want to do all of them in one go. So go over to the model. That's the model I dragged in. And he has different components that can all have their own separate material. Just turn him around so he's a bit brighter. So you select character, press W-E-R. We'll scroll through these options here. So Q, W, E, R, and T for scale, so you can scale them up. And if you hold Control while you spin, you'll get nice even numbers, 5 degrees at a time, or 15 degrees at a time rather. You can make a nice easy 180, and we're going to take the skylight and just brighten him up a bit. One thing I like to do is make a second directional light that's a little bit weaker, so just Control D for duplicate, and maybe point that one this way, and we'll just use that as sort of a skylight, make that a bit less intense, and that way it's not quite as dark in the regions that aren't directly lit. There are heaps of other ways to do that in Unity, but that's just a quick, nasty way to do it. So now you've got your character. If you wanted to paint him, you'd probably already have done this in your modeling tool, 3D modeling tool. There's a cheap and nasty way to do that in here as well. Let's just get some color, maybe something like that. I'm just going to drag that onto his face. It's a bit too shiny. And his hands. I think he has some flesh exposed down here, maybe not. That'll do. It's good enough. Guess it doesn't look as boring now. Okay, so obviously you want him to animate. So to do that, there's a couple of tricks here. So you need to set the rig to be humanoid to use these animations from Mixamo. Makes life a lot easier because it's a humanoid rig. So you just select the character and go up to the rig tab and animation type humanoid, and then apply that. And then here's another, like, if you bring in a character that already has materials, you want to use external materials, and when you apply that, it'll pull in the materials that came with the FBX, with the model, and it'll chuck them in here. He wasn't actually painted, he was a simple grey, so that's just another thing to be aware of when you're using your own characters for this sort of stuff. Okay, so some things you're going to need to animate a character: an animation controller. The anim controller is going to create for this. It's just a single animation. And there's another trick here. So that's the walking animation there. And I can't use that one because I want to loop it, and it's read only when you bring it in. Edit, duplicate, and there's the animation, and it can be modified, so we set that to loop. And now that's the first thing. That the animation controller here is super simple, and again, to describe what you can do with these controllers is way out of scope for this video, but if you want to do a single animation, it's as simple as that. You drag it in, it'll automatically be the first animation that gets triggered, and because it's set to loop, it'll loop forever. So now if we go back and you play, one thing that I missed, it needs to be assigned. So by default that character has an animator component. You can add one of those if it doesn't. It's this guy here. He's already got one, it should already have one. And then just drag that animation controller that we created into the controller slot. Now he walks. If you go back into scene view, you can move around. So that's the first step, the simple step of getting the character to animate with a single animation inside Unity. Next step is just to make something a little bit more interesting. So we want a little planet. We're going to take that and center it. And if we want to just center it under the character the easy way, move it under the character by dragging it, and then reset the position to 0, 0, 0, and that'll put it under the parent. So that's its parent in the hierarchy. And now it doesn't need to be there anymore, so we can drag it back out. It'll maintain its position, and just gonna, for the purposes of keeping things clean, put that here, and we're going to have the sphere is going to live under this object. I'm going to attach a script to this that rotates this sphere. So let's just move the whole thing down a bit so it sits under his feet. Maybe make it a bit bigger. I'm scaling the parent so that the sphere stays uniform scaled where it was, 1, 1, 1, but this object got scaled up, and so any children underneath it get scaled up along with it. So you can see all these individual components of this ninja are children of the parent, and if you, again, scale the parent, so I'm just hitting R to switch into scale mode, scale him up, everything scales with him. Control Z, undo. Okay, so we want this to rotate. That's super simple. There's a lot you can learn about scripting, but this is actually pretty simple to do. So we're just going to go rotation, script, new script, create and add, and then edit script. That'll launch, because I've got Visual Studio installed, that'll launch Visual Studio. There's more simple scripting tools that you can get that aren't as big of a download. If you're just doing something simple, you may not want to go all the way with Visual Studio, but it's a free download, the community version of Visual Studio anyway, so you can get this for free either way. And we're going to do something very simple. I'm going to declare rotation speed, which is going to be a float, and it's public so we can see it in the inspector. Let's just call it rotation, and let's go transform refers to transform here, so it's going to take this transform here and it's going to rotate it on the angle that we give it. And we're going to go new vector 3, something like this. Just not exactly sure where this needs to go. So that's going to rotate it on the x-axis by the value that we supply. I'm not happy about that. Hang on. Okay. And that's essentially done. Now when you go into, go back into Unity, there's that value that we declared. So that was that rotation value that I created up here. That guy. And if I set that to something, we won't see much because this material here is not very useful. Let's just get something with a basic texture on it so we can actually see the rotation. This will do. So I've just created a new material and assigned a base texture to it. And now just drag that onto the sphere. There we go. So just change the tiling of that texture so that we see a bit more of the grid pattern on the sphere. And now set that to an actual value. It's going to rotate it every update. This update happens every tick inside the engine. Every update it's going to rotate by 10 on that x-axis there. So we just go play. That, yeah, I did put it in the wrong field. That's okay. You need to reset the position of this sphere to 0, 0, 0 under the parent. That's what's wrong. I'm just going to set that again. Just dragging it under the little ninja guy, resetting its position. what was actually happening there was this wasn't aligned perfectly to its parent, so when its parent rotated, the sphere was rotating around the center of a different location. That's why everything looked ridiculous. And now when we hit play, it's going to rotate on its own axis, and it's going quite fast. So we can just change that down to 1. There you go. And if you wanted that to be smaller, you could keep doing that. Change that number to something that you're happy with. And when the engine's running and you make changes like that, they won't be saved. They're only saved when the engine's not running. That's to stop you breaking things unintentionally when you're testing. So go back to scene view so we can move around and just light him up a bit better. Then you probably want to do something a bit more interesting in the background. You could bring your own backgrounds in pretty easily. One thing you could do is create a plane, just a 3D plane, scale it up so that it's big enough to be the background. You might not want that shadow there, so you just turn shadows off. On both your lights. He'll look a little bit boring if you do that, so probably we leave soft shadows on. We either turn the camera so that we're looking from an angle where we don't pick up that shadow, like that, or we just change the direction of the light. Probably better solutions for this. Something like that. And you just keep scaling that up till it fills your backdrop. And then it's literally as simple as you take a picture and you just find something. Say something like this. That's just a PNG file that I've dragged in. That's JPEG, sorry. JPEG that I've dragged in from picture downloads. Put that on the backdrop. Looks a bit ridiculous, but it doesn't matter, we're just testing this. So, give you your background. Scale that down a bit so it's not quite as ugly. Nope. Interesting. Oh, okay. So minus 270 instead of minus 90. There we go. There you go. That picture could be anything you want it to be. When I drag that picture onto here, onto the plane, it automatically creates that material. And that material is what's assigned to the plane. So that's done. If you want to record without these grid lines, you turn the grid lines off. Or if you want to get it so that it works right in game view, which you probably should be using the game view, you just take the main camera. It's currently positioned there. You can move it around with the same controls you move everything else, or you can get the angle you like and hit Control-Shift-F, and it'll center the camera where your viewport is currently looking. So now that camera is pointing from where I just was then. And now when I hit play, my game view will be exactly what I wanted. And then you just take a screen recorder GIF tool. Something like Screen to GIF is a good open source one. And you'd record that, and then you'd overlay your music, and you'd be done. pretty simple way to create some GIF art, animated GIF art, without having to go through too much pain of rigging and animating.